Good afternoon, dear friends. Let me invite you this time to the round table, not a panel. I think the only difference, I hope the only difference, is going to be a more interactive discussion between us on this side and you. Now, before I come to the substance, I have been promised that the security personnel will look at the possibility how to open the upper part of the windows, but they are not sure that they will be able to do that before the end of this panel or not. So, under those circumstances, and if I can turn to you with a request whether we could put our jackets off now,
as it's just a jacket.
or just a jacket, or during any moment of our discussions. I see a great potential. I see a great potential for the interactive discussion. Now, transferring democratic values, education, and post-colonial migration in Europe. May I rephrase it? Refugees, education, values. Or shall I start with values? Refugee, education. No, again wrong. Maybe education first. I think that's what I would expect this panel to tackle. And I hope that at the end of our debate, we will feel more secure when we'll be talking about those issues, where many politicians and people, of course, citizens in Europe are trying to come out with their own hierarchical division between those three. I have promised not to make any long introduction. We have a fantastic panel here. We have four distinguished persons. Mona Siddiqui, Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies from the University of Edinburgh, expert in classical Islamic law and Christian-Muslim relations, among many things, chair of the BBC Religious Advisory Committee. We have Tarek Osman, author, I should say a famous author. His book, Egypt on the Brink, which has become international bestseller and actually published before the Egypt, and I will use the word revolution, has been a fantastic contribution to our understanding of the development of the region. Then we have Jill Keppel with us, political scientist, professor and chair of Middle East and Mediterranean Studies at Sciences Po. Published a number of the books on the Middle East and Islamic terrorism and contributes to a number of worldwide newspapers. And last but not least, Roger Scruton, a philosopher, political scientist, who has written more than 40 books, including a political philosophy. He taught at the university in London and Boston, and he is also known for supporting the underground universities in Prague, Brno, and Bratislava during a very different system than the one you enjoy now visiting Prague. Now, I'm Stefan Filler. Until a long time ago, I have been responsible in the European Commission for enlargement and neighborhood policy. One of the lessons learned of the development in the Northern Africa, and not only beyond, in our southern neighborhood, was that we need to have the relationship right between our interest and our values. That whenever we put our interest higher than our values, whenever we omit our values, whenever we sort of push the values to the corner, we have the problems. Whenever we think that the stability should be based on our interest and good relationship with the autocratic leaders rather than on democracy, we sooner or later running up into difficulties. Let's see how we're going to tackle now with the consequences of what I would say were failed revolutions in many countries of the region, and what are the lessons learned for us to make a correct relationship between those three principles or three issues: refugees, education, and values. And can I then, Mona, ask you first to provide your thoughts on this relationship? This is not your first panel, but the first one with the word values
Thank you.
is going to be an important one. Please.
So I'm going to be very brief, because I was just saying to the chair that I'd like there to be more interaction with the audience. But let me just start with what you said just now about keeping our principles above our interests. I'm paraphrasing you. I suppose one of the challenges is, how do you keep your principles of tolerance and inclusivity, if that is a liberal democratic principle, when you are engaging with citizens who are fleeing persecution precisely from people who are not tolerant and inclusive? Is your interest determined by the government of that country, or by your own principles of giving people shelter and affording them something, some hope in life? On the other issue of education, we all talk about education being a good thing, but what we forget is that even if you teach a class of, say, 30 students in the same way, they'll each take a different message away from that education you've just given them. And if we then spread that out at a national level, people come to all kinds of conclusions about what is good and bad based on education. The same education that we think provides a context for pluralism, for freedom of expression, for empathy and sympathy. And in my own experience in terms of the UK, and I'll just finish on this, the whole issue about refugees and migrants and economic migrants has been blurred and really been piggybacked on the whole, on the kind of context of fear that's been spread over the last 4 or 5 years with radical Islam, and also with the fear that what has diversity actually brought to Europe. So we all said diversity was a good thing, but nobody ever tells you why is diversity a good thing. It's just presumed it is. And so therefore the failed experiment of multiculturalism, which, by the way, I think it's failed only in regards to Muslims, not to other minorities. That's the political rhetoric we're getting. Is not because we didn't educate them. It's not because some of these minority communities haven't achieved the highest levels of education, but they haven't still bought into that software or what a liberal democracy is. They are still in that realm of a Muslim or Islam is different to the West. And that rhetoric of us and them continues to provide some tandem in their life. If by education we mean how do we get people to engage as good citizens, as peaceful citizens, we're going to have a real problem, because one of the issues of post-colonial migration has been that second and third migrants or children of migrants have actually rebelled against their own parents, have actually rebelled against their own cultures, because they don't see that as providing the refuge for them. So how do you create a new ethos of living in a vacuum? They don't want all the trappings of British culture, nor do they want the trappings of their culture of their parents. So they're left in a vacuum, really. And so when we talk about hostages, when we talk about refugees coming in now, initially I think we're talking about giving safe haven, safe space for them. But ultimately, I would argue that we can't tarnish and we can't talk about all refugees and migrants in the same way. The majority who are coming from Syria, at least as an outsider listening into the media debates, are not necessarily coming into the West because they want to, but they're because they have no choice. Now, maybe some of them do have a choice, but the majority are educated. They're fleeing. There's a paradox in human nature. We want safety, we want shelter, we want aspiration. At the same time, we are naturally, I think, have evolved over time as sedentary people. And so migration seems a thing of the past. It's almost kind of an anachronism now to Europe, which has become so well-ordered, so stable in its own ways, even though it's rethinking its own future. It's ordered civil societies, and the challenge that migration poses, whether it's the refugees or migration generally, is will this destabilize Europe's well-ordered societies?
Thanks a lot. We invest a lot in the Jordan camps to open the UNICEF-led schools for children there. We invest in Lebanon to open the second shift school for the children of Syrian refugees. We have not yet started the discussion how to turn the education into the instrument of integration of those refugees seeking the asylum in Europe, and more specifically in the European Union. Tarek, may I now turn to you and ask for your own perspective on this issue?
I guess the first point for me at least, is interesting is that, of course, when all of us look at the pictures coming on the TV, and for somebody like myself who have been on many refugee camps in the region, you find very depressing pictures. You find extreme examples of poverty, of people fleeing for their lives. But what people need, of course, to reflect upon is that we are talking about people coming from Syria, from Libya, from countries that only 5 years ago were very stable, quite rich. Libya, for example, even Syria to some extent, had some very interesting high growth rates economically, were considered foreign direct investment destinations. Syria, for example. Libya was considered a partner of some European countries. So there's an element of surprise to many people that what happened really was very sudden in 4 or 5 years, from countries that were apparently very stable and doing well to countries that are not just in crisis, but basically are exporting millions of people risking their lives, very high chances of drowning in the Mediterranean, just to come to Europe. And there's one explanation that everybody keeps talking about, and that is, well, it's dictatorship. This region is full of dictatorships. Another one is a geopolitical explanation. It's all about the unfolding hot and cold war in the Middle East between, on one side, the Saudi/Sunni camp, on the other side, Iran/Shia camp. I just beg to put in front of you few bullet points, perhaps for discussion or for thinking, and I'll be very quick, otherwise Stefan will be very rude to me, as he said. One is, if you look at the post-colonial experience in the Arab world the last 60 years, you, in a nutshell, had two models in a huge simplification. One is the Arab nationalist model, which basically a model that was very inspiring in the 1950s and 1960s. It built new cities, some new countries, some of them very old, like Egypt, Morocco. Some of them are quite new or created, sometimes by the Western powers, but it was very inspiring. It looked at the future saying, we, as an Arab nation, can do amazing things. It also blamed you, so it blamed the West effectively as the culprit behind why we lagged behind for many decades. And the promise was, we now have taken control of our destiny and therefore can do great things. You fast forward 50 or 60 years, we did not do great things, and the state structure that was built by Arab nationalism, at least in the new countries, fell. It is not surprising, or maybe surprising for some, but people need to reflect on the fact that Hafez al-Assad and his son, Gaddafi in Libya, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, these were products of Arab nationalism. So the state model has fell, but the point I want to highlight or leave with you is that there's a mindset that was there, which was very much a state-centric mindset, that the state, the Arab state, can take care of everything and it can make everything wonderful, and it is the element of inspiration. The other model that appeared in the 30 years after the fall of Arab nationalism, more or less, was the Gulf-centric model. Without boring you to death, this is the exact opposite. So this was one in which it was not blaming the West. On the contrary, it was very much, to put it politely, cooperative with the West. It was economically liberally oriented. But to a large extent, though the state was at the center of it, to a large extent it had a tribal/religious center to it. That was the mindset it filled the Arab space with. That model, many would say, has succeeded. If you look at Dubai, if you look at Abu Dhabi, if you look at Doha, these are obviously shining cities many people would love to live in, and you certainly can make nice money living there. The problem is that it's not a model for the Arab world because A, they are tiny, B, they are effectively managed to a large extent by expatriates. So they're not a model for countries like Egypt or Morocco or Algeria or huge countries. So I would say that the two models, more or less, are not inspiring anymore, and that is a major problem for us in the Arab world. Now, if you look at what happened in the last 5 years, with extreme superficiality, you can say that the Arab state structure across the region has more or less fell, and that led to the surface all the problems, the ills, if you'd like, of the last 50 or 60 years. Now there is a huge wars, many wars, I would say, not just war, one war, many confrontations, shall we say, on what will replace that Arab state structure. That's not the talk for us today, I think, though it's a very interesting discussion. But the most important point I want to highlight now, to link that to immigration, is that if you have two huge mindsets that have ruled, if you'd like, shaped the Arab world in the last 50 or 60 years, that have more or less fell, and at the same time you had a huge demographic growth in the Arab world. As we speak right now, there's 330 million Arabs, of which 2/3 are under roughly 35 years old, of which 2/3 are in their teens. Then you can say, yes, in the millions who want to immigrate, and certainly the thousands who are risking their lives, there are many, many who have no place to go, who are ravaged by the lifestyle, by the place that they're in, and therefore our hearts would go out too. That's a humanitarian problem to a large extent. That's a politician's problem in the short term. But there's a long-term dilemma going on that in this huge demography in the Arab world, there are many people who have some financial means and who choose, and that's the key point, they choose not to be part of the Arab world. They are Arabs who do not want to be part of the Arab world. And that happens at the very highest levels, the top brains, if you'd like, and the Arab world is suffering a dramatic brain drain. It also happens at very lower levels of society, people who are gathering all the financial resources they can muster in order to find not just a place as a tiny little $5 earning an hour waiter in Europe. No, they want to start a life, but they want to start that life outside the Arab world. My final 2 points are, you can take the easy route and end such a 7 minutes intervention and say, of course, we need to invest in the civil society, of course, we need to invest in education, and that would be the right thing to do. And I think, yes, that's certainly one way to do it. And actually, the European Union has been doing a lot of that in the Arab world. But it's a very long-term problem and long-term solution. The question, I think, that is real is that as we speak right now, given the demographics of the Arab world, and given the fact in my mind that the state structure in the Arab world and the mindsets that have been there in the last 40 or 50 years have fallen, you do have wide segments of young Arabs who, yes, some are compelled to leave, but some who want to leave. And that's very important. They want to leave. Now, in a way, philosophically, it's very great to say the European model is so successful that these people want to be part of it. That's maybe your problem in a way. But for us, in the Arab world, the model, the problem is even more philosophically wrenching, really more painful, that there are, at the crème de la crème, as well at the bottom of the pyramid, so many white segments that have lost faith in being part of that region. They want out. And in my opinion, that is the sad part of what's happening in the Arab world right now. To end on a positive note, still in the 2/3 of the Arab world that's still under 30 or 40 years old, of course, not everybody would leave, and therefore they would have to create a better future. But that's a hope. I have to say that the picture, as I see it at this stage, because of the fall of the mindset and because of that want to leave, is a damning result of the experience of the Arab world in the last 60 or 70 years.
Thanks. Thanks, Tarek. Gilles, if I may now turn to you. We're starting the debate addressing this in a very complex way and getting us to the bottom of it, in addition to your contribution. Could you also address one element, and it is the lessons learned of your country, the impact of the post-colonial migration, the education in France, ups and downs, and whether there is anything we should take very seriously facing the current wave of migration. Jill.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Well, after Mona told us that sons of post-colonial immigrants nowadays in Western Europe, and particularly in Britain, live in much more of a vacuum than what was the case before. And after Tarek told us that the Arab world is in shambles, and that the vast majority of young people want out, and that this out is Europe, there's not much left for me to draw an optimistic picture. So I'll try to, does this work? No, it doesn't.
Hello? Oh. Miracle. This is from God. Should I start again?
No, no
okay.
need.
Okay.
I guess.
I have an extra 30 seconds. Okay. Well, if you want, I'll go back on my own experience. My father was born in Prague, and he became a Frenchman. And all my youth, I was imbued by the idea that being French was the best thing that could happen to anyone. Not that he shunned his Czech identity. He was a translator into French of Václav Havel, Jaroslav Hašek, and others. But that, you know, through education, and this is why he devoted a lot of effort to his son's own education, we could become French, and we could share in depth the values of the country of which we were being part. That at the time looked like, you know, a possibility, and that had to do also with the politics of integration that were mentioned earlier on, which were part of the great narrative, the grand récit of the French Republic after the Enlightenment period. And it did not matter whether you were the color of your skin, your religion, you whatever. You just, what was more important was what you shared. And you could retain whatever you wanted, but nevertheless, what was in common was more important. This was the fabric of the country. Now, I guess that many of us in Europe still live, more or less, with that in the back of our mind. You know, it's not exactly the same setting in Britain, in France, in Germany, and I mean, we have no time here to discuss that in detail, but many of you are, of course, aware of that. Now, I guess that much of the anxiety that we resent in Europe comes from the fact that there is a fear that this model of integration is not working anymore. It's not working, and to some extent this is a follow-up on what Mona mentioned earlier on, because this feeling that we have more to gain if we share into this liberal democracy model than we have to lose is becoming the mindset of a number of people who feel that they are marginalized, that they do not have access to the benefits of society, and so on and so on, while a number of the resident population, if you wish, feels exactly the contrary, that they pay taxes, they pay social security benefits and so on and so forth for the very benefit of young, idle sons of immigrants who do nothing, who steal cars, burn, whatever, and now are more and more engaged into terrorism and jihadism. Well, this is, of course, a construct. There are parts of it which are true, there are examples which are true, but nevertheless, make it a general picture is, of course, a political construct. But this political construct is gaining weight in Europe and is gaining weight in electoral policies. I mean, the Front National was the first party in France at the European elections, and it is highly possible that they will score two of the main French regions, the Marseille area and the Lille area, in the December regional elections. So, politicians are torn between this hammer and this anvil, and we are facing this refugee issue not really as people of the past were facing the refugee issues of Italians or Jews or Spaniards fleeing fascism, Nazism, and so on and so forth. Though if we go back to that period, we'll see, and historians know better than I do, that those people were not welcome. Spaniards were put into camps after Franco won the Civil War, and so on, etc., etc. But the magnitude of the phenomenon now is, of course, what is probably staggering. So, I believe that it was a well-chosen, if difficult to deal with, topic to focus on education, because we have to understand what we mean with education in Europe today. Education towards what? And I believe that the European Union, and I addressed the former commissioner here, education is not something about, not a topic about which the European Union was that clear. We do not really have a European curriculum. For obvious reasons, because we have different languages, because we have different traditions. We want to blend them to an extent, but not to go above that limitation that we put to ourselves. But this is a challenge that we shall have to face now. I guess that if we want to go forward as a European Union, we have to be more decisive or more critical on the contents of what we believe is a European citizen and how we educate our young people from the eastern borders of Europe to its western borders and from north to east. And if we shun from that, we're going to face tremendous problems. And This is the vacuum also, I believe, that Mona mentioned, and it's a very difficult issue. This is the vacuum which leads some young people, not that many, but by virtue of example, of course, they set a model which is fearful, to go into this ideology of violence in the name of their own interpretation of Islam, which leads to the slaughterings in Paris at Charlie Hebdo, or bombings even at Edinburgh Airport earlier on in Britain, killings in the train, and failed attempt at killing in the Thalys train the other day from Amsterdam to Paris, and so on and so forth. So, as if, you know, they were fleeing this vacuum into a sort of fantasy, which is a perfect society ruled by divine ordinances, and that puts unbelievers to death and creates a sort of model system. This was something which we have encountered in Europe. I mean, we had the Anabaptists of Thomas Müntzer, we had other people, even in some sects after Jan Hus, the Adamites and whatever, and others. But this was never perceived as a phenomenon that was both a challenge from inside, because many of those jihadist kids were educated in European schools, from the Westminster graduate Jihadi John to our École Primaire Française jihadist in Syria, and which was both a domestic challenge and also a challenge perceived as coming from outside. So this is definitely a defining moment. I'm not sure that that people in charge in Brussels are really fully appreciative of the magnitude of the challenge, but if it is not dealt with, I'm very fearful that Europe will be increasingly polarized, not necessarily between Western and former Eastern Europe, but between two types of components. One which is going to turn massively to ultra-nationalist, very right-wing policies, and which will translate into the ballot box, and the other which will increasingly be radicalized into a sort of religious ideology, which will not bring the majority of people, but which will bring people who are ready to commit violence, and then by virtue of example to create a sort of fragmentation of the continent. So I think this is a very serious challenge, and of course, as you see, I have no answer to that, but I believe that it's important that the Václav Havel Forum decided to deal with those issues, and that you know, we try to tackle that. Thank you very much.
Jill, many thanks. There was one thing I learned in Brussels and dealing with member states, that sometimes we have become the hostage of this illusion that if there is a European policy, there is also a European implementation. The financial crisis has tested us, and I think that the migration crisis is pushing us to the limit to realize that very often the policy itself is on the leaders with their local accountability and responsibility, rather than on the EU institutions. And from that point of view, Roger, if I may now turn to you, we have those common values. We hopefully will have a true common policy on migration and asylum seekers. Should we have also a common policy, and not on education, but on bringing more dignity and morality to our education, to address the needs and concerns of the people on both sides, of those who are seeking asylum and those who are providing the asylum?
Well, I think this is such a difficult issue.
there are two separate questions here. One is the problem of migration as we've now been hit by it, which is actually a new problem. This isn't the kind of post-colonial migration that brought Mona's family to Britain, for example. It's a mass migration of people fleeing unacceptable conditions or seeing an opportunity for a different kind of life. And Tarek has shown that this is something huge, something that is beyond our ability actually to deal with it directly, although we're going to have to do something, obviously. I think we had to put that there's that question, which I'm not going to talk about. The question of education is a much more domestic thing, because children are educated in the place where they've ended up. And that has been the real question for us in Britain, and will be the question elsewhere. How do we educate the children of incoming minorities, who may not always be a minority after all? And what kind of thing are we expecting as the result? Gilles gave a beautiful example, namely his own, of a community which fled from this country all over the West, into France and to Britain and to Germany, the Czechs who are quite rightly fleeing the conditions here, but who integrated immediately. We wouldn't have won the Battle of Britain without the Czechs. And all the Czechs that I knew in London were thoroughly patriotic Englishmen as well. There was no problem. They educated their children in the local schools, and that was it. They were like the English. They were people who called themselves Christian because they believed in nothing. And they thought that was quite a legitimate thing to be. And they've never been a problem. The only problem is that they didn't come back here and make this place better than it is. But that's their problem, not ours. But when we turn to the new wave of migrants, obviously we have to look very carefully at what our education system can be and can do. The other day I gave a talk I was invited to give a talk in a London school. There was one English girl in the class. The rest were Somalis, North Africans, Middle Easterns, Romanians, of course, even one or two Czechs, and Poles. And the teachers had the question, what are we going to teach? And our government has left it entirely to teachers to integrate these children. There's nobody else is facing this problem as to how to make these into British citizens. And as Mona said, there are communities who identify themselves as apart from the surrounding culture, even though their children are going to our schools. And this is something that we have to learn to deal with, and whether there is a solution, I don't know. But if you look back over the history of Europe, there was one really rather remarkable precedent, which was that of the Jews. It's not a very encouraging lesson that we take for that, because they were all killed in the end. But nevertheless, they survived in this part of the world for many hundreds of years, and they adapted at the Enlightenment to the prevailing cultural changes. They became integrated. At the time when Moses Mendelssohn was the father of the German Enlightenment, he was also the principal rabbi of his community in Germany. And they survived by separating their religion from the surrounding culture, privatizing it, making it a matter of personal learning. You sit at home reading the Talmud. But you are in public life, you are a German, accepting the rules of the game. You might have to be baptized, but so what? Nobody believes in it anyway. And you end up like in one of the most famous Czechs of the modern world, namely Gustav Mahler, being the principal cultural figure of your day. So, we have set that wonderful example of the Jewish community, but we have to put the Muslim community side by side with that, and of course the Muslim community is not one thing.
and Tarek's already mentioned this. You know, there are those who come from the Arab nationalist background. There are those who come from the Saudi Arabian slave trade. There's those who come from the British Empire, like Mona's family, with all those civilized values intact. What should be our effort, our goal? My only answer is that our goal should be to integrate these people, to make them into citizens of the place where they are, and encourage them, therefore, to privatize all those aspects of themselves which are in conflict. And this is not the lesson that many young Arabic speakers learn from Sayyid Qutb and people like that, who produced their own educational philosophy, which repudiates the whole idea of the nation state, saying you don't belong in a territory, you don't belong to this secular law, you belong to God, and your home is nowhere and everywhere. You know, and that dangerous idea, I think, is getting purchase in Europe, and it's not an idea that you can accommodate. I'm afraid it's an idea you have to be prepared to fight. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Roger. This is quite a unique discussion after raising the questions and through the contribution of panelists, more questions being identified rather than answers. But that's a good start for debate. How to make sure that education is one of those instruments for integration and does not, in the first, second, and third generation, does not contribute to the phenomena we have seen that the people are turning against our set of values, becoming terrorists. What kind of criteria of success here we have? I see two. The right for asylum and right for security should be at the same level, and not one becoming hostage of another one. And second, after this experience and challenge was going to stay with us for years, and we have not yet seen the whole magnitude of it, we will call it a success only if we would not tend to political correctness to explain what once was or were European values. Now it's your turn. Push the four panelists as much as you like. No taboo. No red lines. We left political correctness behind the door. I should have the two microphones there somewhere. Okay, there is a lady there in the second row, and then I have you, sir.
The lady is
and you.
Bianca.
Just wait, the microphone is on its way.
I have a big voice.
Oh, you do.
I'm born and bred here in Prague, but I also have two other homes in Hawaii, USA, and Canada. And so I'm looking at it from all kinds of perspectives. I appreciate all your words, particularly you, because you really put it together for some of us who are not extremely politically aware or aware as such. I really appreciate that. My question here is a little bit related. Is there any space for education / information to the people who intend to come prior to their coming? And I appreciate that in the camps and so on, it's hardly the situation, but I still like to put the question forth. Thank you.
Good, excellent. If you want to specify, I would like to answer those specific questions. Don't hesitate. We will take two more questions, and then I will ask the panelists to react. I think there was you. I saw his hand, and then the man in the second row.
Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. I believe one of the great challenges we will have, as the Commissioner has pointed out, and as all of our distinguished panelists have touched upon, is that the process is only beginning, and we will need to create a basket of solutions which is continually evolving. One of the basic questions, and you spoke of this morning, and I was responding to it, is the question of giving hope to the refugees, the immigrants, and indeed we must not separate these concepts because history is full of these emigrations for very valid reasons that start in each person's family. That's where it begins. So I would like to suggest that some of the issues we might address are including things like birthright citizenship, which is not universal. One of the perhaps depressing concepts in some countries is that immigrants and refugees have no clear path to becoming citizens. In fact, in some countries, such as Germany, and I don't want to single out Germany, but it's only an example, there is no path. And this is unfortunate, and I think that for those particularly in school and leaving school and coming through the education process, they need to see tangible, achievable hopes. And this is one of them that will give them a sense of community and a sense of belonging. At least this has been my experience. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that and other ideas. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. And the final in this first row of the questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. Peter Head, Charles University. First of all, I would love to...
Would you be so?
Yeah. First of all, I would love to thank all the organizers. In these turbulent times, you have a place of peace to meet and discuss openly. I'm glad you asked for open-minded questions. I would like to go back to Professor, Dr. Professor, what all your titles are, Scruton. And you posed a question which I would like to change from a rhetorical question to a real question. There are many people with good experience, with great experience and wisdom concerning Islam and Muslims. I would really love to hear your best thoughts, like altruistic thoughts on what would be one of the pieces of the recipe, how to make Muslims behave the same way as the Jews have managed to become over centuries, that religion is really only and part of private life and not of public sphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I like all three of them. And I think the third one was really great. Mona, would you like to start and choose the order and which one you would like to react?
Well, I'll respond to what you were just saying and what Roger referred to as, in a way, the Jewish parallel. And the only thing I would say, well, first of all, a broader question would be, how do we measure the success of integration? Is it when there are no more bombs? How do we measure it? Because for years we didn't measure integration. It wasn't till violence appeared on our streets. But with respect to the Jewish parallel, it's been brought up several times over the last few years. The majority of Muslims who came to the UK, and the majority, I think, who also traveled to Western Europe, came from very rural, tribal, uneducated backgrounds. The majority who were educated went to the USA. And for years, the wisdom was that that's why American Muslims feel American and Muslim, whereas British Muslims still have this problem of integration, because they have not been educated enough. But actually, violence has shown us that education may have quite little to do with how you feel about where you live. The parallel with the Jewish one is an interesting one because it's used an example of these are people who can separate religion from public life. So I would beg the question, why is there a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe? If the Jews have integrated, a majority of them are white, a majority of cultural affinities, why is there a problem of anti-Semitism in Europe? I think in terms of the UK, the Jewish parallel is difficult again because of education. The majority are, it's, you know, as we often say, you're never going to find somebody who's Jewish and not educated. So education has had a huge impact on their family ethics, their family ethos. And when you look at the majority of immigrants in the UK whose families have put a huge impact on not just education for for the sake of getting O-levels and university degrees. But actually, education is a transformative factor in the way you live your life. It's a class thing. The majority of those will tend to be from the middle. And, you know, class speaks to class across cultures in a way that is quite difficult for us to admit, but it does. The majority of middle-class Muslims, let's say, have a lot in common with the majority of middle-class white families, if I can put it like that. Where there are issues is on, and I go back to this, and in a way I feel that I've gone full circle from this morning, is that we can't afford to be complacent about what a good democracy is. It needs work, it needs negotiation. It constantly needs people who have a stake in society to say, this is my issue, how do we resolve this as a collective? Rather than constantly polarizing the presumed native community that is bought into the trappings of democracy and the others who are constantly against it. It just doesn't work like that. So in response, just very briefly to what you were saying about how do you educate these people, education is not necessarily with these new refugees coming in. What would you educate them on? What would you say to them? When you come to this country, you must behave like this, you must work like this, you must speak like this. I think I know what you're trying to say, but there's a kind of presumption there that we have things to teach these people that they may not know. Well, they may know it. They may be more educated than all of us in this room, some of them. But they are also victims of their circumstances. So I think the measure, how we measure integration, you know, if there is no other bomb that goes off, let's say, in the next 10 years, will we be still having this discussion? Because it's violent extremism that has forced you to rethink integration. It wasn't about these people living in ghettos. It wasn't so much about these people intermarrying. These were things that Europe disdainfully looked at, but it wasn't until the arrival of violent extremism then we started reflecting, oh gosh, they haven't really integrated into our values.
Well, thanks. Roger, your name has been mentioned. Can I ask you now and then the two remaining panelists to address also the remaining questions, as actually has been attributed to the panel as a whole? Roger.
Well, of course, the question of how to persuade Muslim communities to follow the Jewish example is a very, very difficult one. My feeling is this, that we Christians have been taught from the beginning to laugh at ourselves. You know, irony is part of the message of the Gospels. And we see it very clearly in Christ's dealing with the woman taken in adultery, when he asked the person who's without fault to cast the first stone. In other words, look into your own heart and see how ridiculous you are, because you wanted her too. You know, that way of putting ourselves at a distance from our own faith is probably a part of what schooled us for the democratic process. And it has to be said that, you know, that Muslims are not very good at laughing at their own faith. Indeed, we've seen the results of others trying to laugh at it rather seriously of late. So I would think cultivating this distance from your faith and making that into a part of public life would be a very a positive suggestion. Teaching people also that however your faith came into the world, it came as a revelation from Allah, it came in the person of God's Son or however, your interpretation of it may have got it wrong. And the person, whoever it was, who wrote down the Quran may have got it wrong. You know, we ought to be able to take a critical attitude and correct things, as indeed the early Muslim jurists did. I'm sure Mona would agree with this. Until the declaration that the great gate of Ijtihad is closed, there was plenty of interpretation going on, adjusting the faith to the demands of secular life and vice versa. And I feel that we lost that through all sorts of historical circumstances that we can't undo, but we could perhaps start to work on that again. So that would be my answer. I don't know whether I get the endorsement of the only Muslim on the panel, but...
Can I just say very briefly?
Yes, please, absolutely.
I actually think that saying we Christians and you Muslims doesn't do anything to further the debate. But would you be saying that about the Christians in the Bible Belt, that they're all laughing at themselves? You're talking about a very European Anglican Christianity. I mean, you said earlier they don't believe in anything. So it becomes easy to laugh at yourself when you don't believe in anything. And I completely agree that maybe Muslims do have an issue about being able to self-satire. I absolutely agree with you that. But I think putting it in that way, that there is a whole Muslim community out there that can't laugh at itself, but we Christians know because Christ said something in the Bible, I think that's a really reductive way of engaging this.
No, it wasn't. It was me expressing my views. You know, I mean, it's because we don't express our views that all these conflicts get worse. You know, and I think we should, you know, I laugh at myself and I like laughing at you too, when you make yourself ridiculous.
You're entitled to your view. I'm just saying that for somebody as esteemed as you, to say that we Christians and you Muslims, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, well,
it does reduce
I'm only speaking for myself here.
Well, if I may include right here, I think this issue of laughing at oneself and at laughing at the other, of course, was crucial because one of the big issues and the big problems that we encountered was the cartoons, the Mohammed cartoons affairs, and you know, their late outcome and the Charlie Hebdo assassinations, because the killers, after they killed the 12 cartoonists and a number of other people, and there was no we and no they, because they killed a number of people who were Muslims also, who they deemed were bad Muslims, apostates, who were there, who happened to be there. They just shouted in the streets of Paris, "We revenge the Prophet." And so this is why we killed them. So there is this issue of having to be able to be distanced from one's own sanctities. And what we now see in Europe is this feeling that because there is this lack of confidence in the sort of the social fabric, the overall social fabric, there is a sort of feeling that what gives you shelter, what helps you make out your way is the fact that you cling to a communal identity, which is defined by theological preconceptions or what have you. And this is why this is where I believe, and I've seen that over the last 35 years that I've been working on this phenomenon in Europe, that there's this mounting feeling that there are we's and there are us's, and not asses, but us's, and if I may say so, and or arses, whatever the way you want to pronounce it, and that there is the infidel and the believer. There is the foreigner and the citizen, and so on and so forth. And this is a problem also, I believe, that is a byproduct of the building of the European Union, because European Union has given a lot of relativity to national identification, of course. Now, you know, I mean, what are the layers of decisions in Europe? And, you know, most of the states, all the European states, have no money now. I mean, when you think of, you know, funding politics of education, of research, for instance, either you go to your land or your region, or you go to Brussels. But the German state or the Czech state or the French state has no money left. And so there is this feeling that, you know, there are new layers of identifications. Brussels is very difficult to reach out to. You have to go through a tremendously difficult bureaucratic process and red tape in order to achieve something. And then you meet with people in Brussels who are not into pursuing a policy, but into being fearful that they will be judged on the fact that things are misspent and so on. So you know that process very well, and this is what we face. And we feel that, as opposed to the United States, for instance, where there is some sort of a centralized state with a policy which is voted in by the electors, whether right or wrong, our relation as European citizens with the Union is blurred by a number of layers that we are incapable to go through. And then the national layer is vanishing, and then you have those community things which pop out from here and there, and which give you probably a false feeling of not only of belonging but of protection, and this is a process which I've seen mounting over the last decades, and this leads to the fact that you do not put trust in education anymore if you believe that education is not going to satisfy with the sanctities of your own community. That when I said earlier on that what we have in common is more important than what is different, in a number of cases is trying to go in reverse now. And I guess that this is one of the challenges that we have to face, and that the Union itself has to take.
And that's why I was so sort of careful, I mean, not to call for a common approach to education. Okay, Tarek?
Okay, I have 4 points actually to respond to the 2 questions, and I'll try to be brief. The first is a historical point. To put it bluntly, Muslims in the European psyche is the other, culturally the other, and Europeans or Christendom in the Muslim psyche for centuries has been the other. That has not changed much in the last 150 years, which is the lifetime of modernity in the Arab world, Arab/Islamic world. So if you get out of think tanks and the liberal media and in both sides of both shores of the Mediterranean, the idea of the other remains the same. You are the other to the Arab world, and we are the other to you. So comparisons to other religious or cultural groups in Europe, in my opinion, are not congruent, not to my mind. It's not the right comparison. These are heritages of centuries, of so many peaceful and hostile encounters, but we have always been the other. Anyway, that's the first point. The second point is, you're talking about what can we teach them. And note that the Arab, again, / Islamic world's exposure to modernity has been now roughly 2 centuries. And by modernity, of course, I mean Western modernity. But to be very, very brief, remember that from, say, 1880s, 1890s, until the 1930s, 1940s, there was, in my view, a very vibrant, vivacious, I would say beautiful, liberal age across much of the Islamic world, and specifically the heart of the Arab world, North Africa and the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, that experiment failed, and why it failed is a long story, but failed. But the important thing in that second point I want to draw attention to is that how can Islam function in a modern or modernizing society? It's not a new question, it's a very old question. And that one of the crucial sad things for me as an Arab is that today in 2015 we are confronting effectively the same questions that we confronted in 1880, 1890, 1900. That's my problem, not your problem as a European. But my point is the question you're posing is actually so old. The sad thing, again, is that we are, to a large extent, starting from scratch. And because we have squandered so much, we as Arabs squandered so much of our heritage and actually lost a lot of it. And because of the demographic changes as well in the Arab world, to a large extent, many segments are starting from scratch to confront questions their grandparents confronted. Point number 3, of course, since we are talking about education, it was one of the questions. Of course, education will be a major help, and it is actually witnessing very good developments in the Arab world. But by far more important, in my mind, than education is exposure. Keep in mind that this is the first time ever in the history of the Arab world, ever, that the youngest generation in the Arab world, which is the largest generation in the Arab world, is by far, much more exposed to the world, not just to you in the West, to the world, than its parents and grandparents. And that forces that young generation. I have a half-brother and half-sister who are 19 and 20. And I can see it in them and in their friends. It forces them to ask questions that when I was 20, I never asked. I know certainly when my father was 20, he never even knew probably about. That exposure is dramatic. And the good thing is it's not controlled. Education at the end of the day, whether public or private, is controlled. Exposure is not. If there's one thing that's doing wonders in the Arab or Islamic world, it's the internet. My final point is, which is specifically to Islam. I'm not going to go into long debate because I'll probably be speaking for the next 5 hours, but keep in mind that one of the fundamental tenets, one of the key tenets of Islam is its view, or a very important school of thought in Islam that has viewed the religion as deen wa dawla. Might sound even similar to you. Religion and state. And state here implies not just top-down political structure, but its central, some would say, sole role in society. I'm not saying this is Islam, but this has been a dominant view in Islamic history in the last at least 10 centuries, probably since the gate of Ijtihad has been closed in the 12th century. But what I'm trying to come with is that Islam, at the end of the day, like any social phenomenon, is a social phenomenon impacted by social, economic, and political impacts and factors. The history of the Arab world in the last 80 years, since effectively the fall, the crumbling of the Arab liberal experience, has been a very sad story. So all the social, political, and economic factors that have shaped the role of religion in Arab societies have been very bad factors. That means that the dominant interpretations of Islam today are actually not particularly inspiring. The final point, because Stephen is looking at me, is that the approach that has been dominant in the Islamic world in the last 60 or 70 years has not been inspiring, but given the dynamics happening in the Arab world, the exposure, the demographics, there are new approaches, theologically, as well as about the role of Islam in society. And that's very inspiring.
So much about your basket of concrete ideas, how to help, although I like the idea about the lady in the second row concerning starting the education already in the area from where the migrants and asylum seekers are leaving. And what I'm getting from this very lovely discussions you had is the ability of self-reflection. I think this is this ability of self-reflection which allows you to understand that your own well-being and survivability depends not only what you believe in, but also others around you values. Okay, we have now another round of questions. Too many hands. Okay, man in the first row.
Good afternoon, Tomáš Císař, architect. Coming back to the theme of this panel or this roundtable as post-migration in Europe, one of the extreme phases which European cities are has a legacy of this post-migration is ghettos, like the problem of identification. And I would like to, hear from you what is your perception about Central European politicians which are now in the position of ultimate raising flag of kind of mental ghettos, putting Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland in some kind of mental ghetto vis-à-vis the European identity. Do you think that one of the reasons is lack of education or lack of experience with this post-war colonial migration? Or do you think this is some historical reasons for why those politicians are putting Central European kind of vacuum, which was already mentioned many times? Thank you.
Thank you very much. hold your horses. Let me look around whether there are some other hands up. Yes, lady in the second row.
Yes, thank you. My name is Leusha Sovadinova, and I am living here in Prague now, currently taking care of the children. I have actually two questions. One is about what Mona mentioned, maybe. I lived in Britain about, well, it's nearly 20 years ago, for quite a while, and I realized that there were already communities of the Muslims and being, well, keeping themselves kind of separated from the rest. And there was even like the positive racism there, that the Muslims could do something where the English couldn't do that. And now I'm actually surprised that it's still, the communities, it still continues. Actually, there's the question, but it still continues, because from the point of view, from the outside point of view, it seems that it actually continues, that the Muslims are still trying to be, well, kept in the community rather than really being integrated in the rest of the society, which is the one question.
Okay.
And then the second question, if I may ask Tarek, because I was quite surprised that you said that about 5 years ago, those countries who are now in the war, they were rich and quite stable. Is it possible that actually no one expected that something like the war will happen in the future? There were no signs that this is going to happen? Because in Europe, actually, we are saying, or I heard it a few times, that this is the refugee crisis is one of the biggest movement of the people from the Second World War. And I'm just, well, questioning myself whether no one expected something like this to happen when everything in the history repeats, actually, itself from time to time. Thank you.
Okay, and the third question, the man in the first row, in the middle. Hold on. Okay, now.
Pavel Kramer from Prague.
Could you mind, stand up, let others...
And my question is, what is your guess? How many migrants do you think would come in the following 10 years? And do you think... No, it's just... And do you think that it may come to a point that Europe will physically shut down, so will build some sort of wall around the territory? Or do you think that this huge amount of immigrants will stop or will slow down? So what is the prospect like in 10 years' time? Thank you.
Okay, just to make it a little bit easy on panel, I don't want to open the issue of the difference between the illegal migration, economic migration on one side, and illegal migration, economic migrations are not the same, and asylum seekers on the other side. Okay, and you have a different ways, how to tackle it, and so on. And your question, if being put, sort of understanding the difference, I'm sure would give us here sort of the possibility to address it with a positive spin rather than negative spin. The next point is the questions concerning the experience of the Czech Republic. I don't know, to what extent the panel would like to answer. You're free. I would just say only one thing as the only Czech and Central European sitting in this panel. Yes, it's education. Yes, it's not understanding what this membership ticket we got to join the European Union, what it means. And yes, it's about not to have the courageous politicians to lead, but to follow. Tarek, you have been asked specifically, and again, I'll leave it up to the panel, Mona then, you again, to address the questions. Tarek.
Sure, okay.
And try to, this time...
I wasn't that long the first
time. No. I just give you now an example.
Okay, on the first question, yeah, I'm not sure not many people saw the Arab uprising coming. Many people spoke actually about a change coming to the Arab world from the young generations. and only to be stopped by the entrenched powers. So I think some people have seen it, maybe not necessarily the way you put it. But to answer immediately your question, right now you have basically 3 countries in the Arab world that has popped, if you'd like. These were Iraq, Syria, and Libya. I would say there are at least 2 or 3 other countries that are very vulnerable right now, very vulnerable. And the second point is that the Arab state structure in the new countries, not the very old countries, and so then in many countries in the Arab world is also unstable. That means that you can expect safely expect that there will be other crises in the Arab world. And if one of these crises happens in countries that are demographically large or have large number of refugees, then the numbers you're seeing right now could become exponentially higher. That's the first point. On the second point, which I think somebody asked me about barriers and Europe shut down. Europe will not shut down, obviously. Europe is the most successful human experiment in my mind by far. So it will not shut down. The second point you put is barriers. Would Europe put barriers? Europe is already shutting down the door and putting lots of barriers, in my opinion. But the big question mark, and Stephen would know this much better than I do, but in the discussions I was involved in with some European decision makers or shapers, there are different options. One option is to work with the strong regimes of the Arab world, to put it politely, so they handle the issue. And the other point is more or less to have some sort of a Marshall Plan, huge economic development in the areas where the migrations are coming from. The third one is to use force. Europe, to a large extent, is relying on the first at this stage, to a very large extent. That could work as long as these strong regimes remain in power. If they pop, then you have a problem. The second issue, using force, I think will be morally very problem, especially at a time when you have what's happening more or less with the open media, what have you. Third one, which is the Marshall Plan or economic development, unrealistic given the austerity and the economic situation in Europe right now. So I think to a very large extent, this is a problem that Europe will continue to face. To be blunt, I think there will be lots of tactical measures in the next 5 or 10 years, nothing strategic. The only strategic solution, I think, will come from the Arab world. And if I were to say one final point, or stop?
Last one.
One final point is that, yes, there are vulnerable countries. Yes, the state structure is falling, but to a very large extent, to my mind, the Arab world today is very similar to the Arab world in the early 19th century. Shaky, fluid. And one of two things will happen, and probably they will happen, both of them, but in different parts of the Arab world. You will see lots of fragmentation, and you will see lots of solidification, so new structures coming, politically, socially. But the good news is, after a very long period of fluidity and lots of problems, as has happened 200 years ago, either fragmentation or solidification, or both in different parts of the Arab world, will lead to stability. The good news is the pace is much faster than 200 years ago, and this time big questions, such as the role of religion, are very much on the table, which I think would make the solutions more sustainable.
Tarek, thanks. Mona?
So I'll just be very brief. The question about let's also just be careful that we don't reduce just the Arab world to the Islamic world. The Islamic world in India and Indonesia is far bigger than the Middle East. But I think we're actually not in a post-colonial environment. I think we're in a neo-colonial environment where much of the Islamic world is still reeling from the colonialist powers. And so if modernity came to the West through Enlightenment, it came to much of the Muslim world through colonialism. And rightly or wrongly, it sees modernity as something that has to be contested. And then the radicalization narrative plays into that. Modernity is the West, and the West has to be resisted. And unfortunately, at the moment, I would say quite unequivocally that the Islamic world, both geographically and also in terms of the migrations in Europe, and it goes to your points, is not confident in itself. It doesn't know where it's going. It doesn't know where it's going ethically, ideologically, or politically. And when you're not confident in yourself, you tend to shut down. It's only when you're confident that you are embracing and tolerant and generous. And I suppose, in a way, just to finish off, that is the dilemma that Europe is facing. Its own confidence and generosity and openness has now created a situation where it is facing that moral dilemma. Do we shut down in terms of bringing more people in? Or is it at the very heart of our principle that we let others in and try and integrate them into the values that we cherish? And I think that's going to be a European dilemma for a long time.
Thanks, Mona. Joe, Roger, would you like to add anything?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mona's absolutely right to insist that the Islamic world is not identical with the Arab world. And I think one should never forget the 10% of Arabs who are Christians. You know, they're important people who created part of the revival of revival of Arabic civilization, and by side effect, some of Islamic civilization in the late 19th century. And I feel that they are the victims, the principal victims of the present conflict in Syria. And when it comes to the European approach to all these things, I am not a pro-European. It's quite obvious, you just have to look at me. So I'm in favor of the use of force when force is the right procedure. Europe grew out of a kind of pussyfooting about force. You know, we're not going to use force anymore about anything. But when it comes to ISIS in Syria, you could ask anybody in Britain whether we should use force, and you would get a majority response which would say yes. Why do we not use force to create a safe area in Syria? Eliminate those criminals and make it clear to people that you're going to be prepared to put behind your action the resources that are necessary to rebuild the country. I don't see why we shouldn't do that in the end. The European Union would be an obstacle to that because it has this absurd idea that borders must never be defended, and that we're all open to the movements of people. But in fact, borders must be defended, and Europe exists only because people have been prepared to defend them in the past. There, that was strong stuff, wasn't it?
It was. It was. But Roger, 1 + 1 is 2. You cannot really...
Chairman, could I pop in here and ask you, as a former commissioner for enlargement, what are your thoughts about enlargement back now, in retrospect? I mean, enlargement was the religion of the European Union for a number of years. Okay? Now, it looks like we're being relapsed on this religion. We're becoming apostates of enlargement as Europeans. What do you think of that?
He's asking me...
no, in your private capacity, I mean...
4 minutes after you have shown me the 5 minutes time we have...
Yeah, you still have 3.
No, this is not a religion.
I was just joking, but I mean...
This is acceptance that it has the most powerful instrument of transformation. But I want to... okay, we'll have the last question, 15 seconds, which will then give the opportunity to panel to address it or to make some final comments. With me trying to formulate, which is going to be extremely difficult, 3 recommendations. But before that, I will not fail to react to what Roger said. I too believe that the Schengen area free movement of personnel cannot be sustainable with a strong protection of external borders. As clear as that. 1 + 1 is 2. Anything else is self-delusion. Okay, we have that last question. The man in the first row, he was the fastest. It's a 15 seconds, and it's a question, not a comment, please.
Okay, my name is Lev Gedrich. I'm a student at NYU's Leonard and Stern School of Business. I'm spending a semester here in Prague. A little bit about my background. I'm the son of immigrants. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, they came to America to give me a better life. So my question is pretty simple. What makes them any different than any other immigrants, any parents, any people who went to a different country seeking a better life for their children? Is this not rooted in economics? Is there not secularization when you see a rise in wealth, etc.?
Got it. Thanks a lot. Joe, with a perfect opportunity to address this and also your thoughts about the discussion so far.
Back to my dad. Well, it's a matter of the general context and the perception of the phenomenon. It's what was discussed in this panel, the crumbling of the Arab world system, the failure of those post-colonial Arab states, which now pushes onto the roads many of their erstwhile citizens. And it's also this feeling that the European system, and at the core of its education, is at pains bringing about their integration into European society. And it also has to do with the question mark about enlargement, which will not be addressed. But I guess that it's mainly an issue of representation. But this issue of representation is important because it's going to be translated into politics. And it's translated also into the behavior of a number of people in Europe today, whether they are sons of immigrants or whether they are locals. So this is, I guess, where the difference lies.
Jill, thanks a lot. Any final?
No, it's been a great panel, but I just wish we had more panels like this in the Muslim world.
Good. Roger?
Yeah, it's a question of the kind of upbringing that the immigrants themselves have had and what they're expecting and whether their worldview permits them to integrate. Your parents came from a background which does permit integration, but you have to compare them with the background of the Boston bombers, who came from a similar region, but not actually, your ethnic Russian.
Thank you, Roger. Tarek?
I guess my final point is that I look at it from the other side, from the Arab world, and all of these waves of migration, leaving the human dimension of it out, at the end of the day, expedites, if you'd like, makes the process faster in terms of the transformation that's happening in that part of the world, as well as in the relationship between Europe and that part of the world. And for me, that's the interesting question of that wave.
Thanks. First point would be that no one could undervalue the importance of education and ensuring the integration of the migrants, of asylum seekers. Point has been made about the transformative power of education, but it's also obvious education itself without a further employment and further element of integration would not work. The second point is that it is about democracy. We will be as successful, as strong our democracy will be, as sincere we will be to each other at both the member states level and the European Union levels. Because very often we tend to accuse each other about not doing enough. And the third element would be that the right to education, right to asylum, right to security, there is hardly any hierarchy. And the reason is that they are part of our set of values, and we need to defend them all. It has been a great panel. Thank you very much. I feel, at least my humble part, that we need more of these discussions without red lines, definitely without political correctness. Thank you very much, and enjoy your day. Thank you.